Welcome to Hire Power, the show where we cut through the noise and get real about hiring. I'm Kim Frost, founder of Frost Connections, and after 25 plus years in the search industry, I've seen what works and what absolutely doesn't. If you're a founder, CEO, VP, or HR leader who's tired of bad hires and ready to build a team that actually fits your culture and vision, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. Let's talk about something most leaders won't say out loud, but every single one of us has felt at some point. What do you do when your team has lost trust in you? And it's not in a dramatic way, it's in a subtle way. There's hesitation, definitely lack of engagement, some quiet pushback, or worse, the nodding in meetings and then nothing happens after. This episode and the next one, I'm going to forewarn you, are going to be a little uncomfortable because next week I'm going to flip it to talk about what do you do when you don't agree with your CEO or executive leadership. So yes, per true to my form, we're getting into the real stuff, and I'm not going to be shy about it. Trust is not a nice to have in leadership anymore. It is the operating system, aka culture, of your team. In today's environment, constant change, AI disruption, shifting priorities, trust is under pressure. Gartner has been tracking this closely, and what they're seeing is clear. The organizations that perform best are the one where leaders consistently explain the why behind the decisions. And let me preface that it's not just once, it's constantly bringing people back to the why. Demonstrating accountability, and then actively work to identify and close trust gaps. When that happens, you don't just get a better culture, you get a team that can actually perform through uncertainty. Because trust directly impacts engagement, productivity, cohesion, and yes, turnover. So, this is not a soft conversation, this is business. Let's talk about how trust actually breaks down because it's rarely one big dramatic moment. It's usually a series of decisions and behaviors that compound over time. Trust erodes during layoffs and restructuring, absolutely. Everyone gets paranoid. New leadership coming in and changing direction quickly, which is never a good thing. Lack of transparency around key decisions, which in my mind is probably the worst. Scapegoating when something goes wrong, or constantly shifting priorities without context. Here's the uncomfortable truth. It's not usually the decisions that break trust, it's how those decisions are handled. And when trust starts to go, it spreads fast. One conversation turns into five. Five turn into a narrative. And suddenly your team, and sometimes your entire organization, is operating from a place of skepticism instead of alignment. And unfortunately, I'm sure many of you listening have all been there and witnessed this on one side of the table, either as a leader or watching a leader unwind like this. If you've ever heard me talk about employee brand, this is exactly how it gets damaged. Not externally first, internally. So, what do you do if you're in it? You can feel something is off. That's not paranoia. That's where you need to trust yourself as a leader. What are the signs? Your team is quieter, they're less engaged, maybe a little resistance, or worse, checked out. This is where leadership actually matters because most leaders respond in one of these three ways. They tighten control, they avoid it and hope it passes, or they try to boost morale with surface level fixes. But unfortunately and realistically, none of those rebuild trust. Rebuilding trust comes down to three things: accountability, consistency, transparency. You've heard me say this all before, so it's not new, but this is where it gets real. So let's start with accountability. If something didn't land well, own it. Not in a polished, over communicated way, in a real way. Here's the decision we made. Here's what we got right. Here's what we missed. That level of ownership is rare. And because it's rare, it builds trust fast. Your team already knows when something didn't go well. You're not telling your team anything new. You're showing them whether or not you're self aware. Another one of my favorite topics. Next, there's consistency. This is where most leaders lose people. You cannot say one thing and then behave differently when pressure hits. You cannot talk about transparency and then go silent when decisions get tough. You cannot say you value your team and then exclude them from conversations that directly impact them. Consistency is what turns words into belief. Without it, trust never stabilizes. And then we have my favorite, transparency. And this one needs some nuance. Transparency does not mean telling your team everything. We've talked about that before. But rather, it means telling your team what matters and then explaining the why. Unfortunately, this is where leaders struggle. They either over explain and sound like they're justifying, or under communicate and create lots of confusion. So the balance is this: explain your rationale behind the decisions, not defensively, not emotionally, just clear. Here's what we're going to solve for. Here's what we've considered. Here's why we chose this direction. Simple, clear, transparent. And then pause. Let your team respond. They may not respond immediately, but hopefully they will respond. Because this is where trust starts to rebuild, not in what you say and how you listen. This is the one part that gets overlooked the most. It doesn't start with technology. It doesn't start with AI. It doesn't start with a new communication strategy. It starts with the good old-fashioned listening, real listening, creating space for your team to ask questions, to challenge, to push back without shutting them down. If your team doesn't feel heard, they won't trust you, even if your decisions are right. So, how do you assess trust on your team? Because a lot of leaders assume it's there or assume it's not without really knowing. So, here are a few ways to get a real read. One is hold small group conversations, not just large meetings. Some people are not comfortable speaking in meetings. I love this. I heard this from a leader. They created a quote, ask me anything, unquote sessions. Love that idea. Brilliant. Of course, this leader was an extremely reputable and favorite leader. Then pay attention to what is not being said in meetings. Watch the expressions. Watch the follow through. Are people really aligned or are they just shaking their head and agreeing? And here's something else to keep in mind. Trust doesn't just flow top down. It flows across and it flows up, meaning how you lead your team impacts how they show up across the organization. I'm going to say that again because I think it's super, super powerful. How you lead your team impacts how they show up across the organization. This is not isolated. Let me give you one uncomfortable truth before we wrap up in classic Kim form. If your team doesn't trust you, it's not a communication problem. It is a leadership behavior problem. But that's the good news because behaviors can change. You, as a leader, play an instrumental role in building or rebuilding trust in your organization. In fact, I would be absolutely surprised if you haven't had to do this yet in your career. And if you haven't, get ready because it will eventually happen, not because of anything you as a leader have done incorrect or wrong. It is just the evolution of leadership and human behavior. This isn't easy, right? It requires self-awareness, discipline, and a willingness to hear things you may not like. But when you get it right, oh my gosh, everything becomes easier. There's alignment, there's execution, there's retention, there's performance. There are smiles on faces again. All of it. So, if this episode hit a little close to home, good. That means you're paying attention. Next week, we're going to flip this and talk about what do you do as a leader when you don't agree with your CEO or the executive leadership team. That is equally as delicate, equally important on how you lead through that. Okay, until next time. And then after that, we'll go back to puppies and wombats, my husband's favorite line when I'm stressing out. See you next week.
That's it for this episode of Hire Power. If you're ready to hire smarter, connect with me at frostconnections.com or at LinkedIn at Kim Frost. And if you've got something to say about today's episode, follow the show and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, hire smart, lead better, and remember, how you hire is who you become. See you next week. No fluff, just better hires.